Alright, our next video segment in the Gilded Age covers politics. At the beginning we'll go a little bit in depth into kind of what's going on politically, but then at the end we'll definitely be doing an overview, a real quick look at the presidents and what are the significant events of their administrations. So a lot of those things we've covered in other videos, so if you see something and you want to know more about it, look back in your notes, look back in those other videos. Alright, so let's get into it. We'll start with political participation. What is the voter participation like? And initially, voter participation was pretty high in the Gilded Age. Imagine 70 to 80% of our eligible voters actually participating in elections. To give you an idea of how big that is, now in the 2016 election, I think voter participation was somewhere around 50%. So ridiculously low numbers. And so here you have our little chart here, 1876. Voter participation up here just above 80, and it stays up around there through the 1800s, and then it starts to decline. Okay. There are reasons why this political participation was high early on. People were just more willing to vote. They saw themselves, they saw their party, they saw the democratic process being vital to the country, to the survival of liberty and democracy. During Reconstruction, participation in the South was very high. You have federal troops down there protecting African American rights to vote. But as the Gilded Age goes on, voter participation starts to steadily decline. You saw that in the line as it started above 80, it started to slide below 80 into the 70s, and eventually even lower. In the South, a huge part of that is because of the disenfranchisement that African Americans are going to face with the implementation of the Jim Crow system. But it's also a reaction to the political corruption that people see, not only on a local scale with the political machines and Tammany Hall and those guys, but also on a national scale. When they start learning about some of the scandals that the national government, that the national office holders are even involved in. And so for some people, they kind of got fed up with it and deciding it didn't matter who you voted for, whether they're Republican, Democrat, they were all corrupt. They were all just the same thing. Okay? It doesn't help that the two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, have very few clear, specific differences. We'll start with the Republicans. They were the party of expanded government. When they controlled Congress, when they controlled the White House, they used their power to expand the powers of the national government, to get it more involved. Okay? They supported high tariffs to protect American industry, and they specifically championed a platform of higher pension payments to Union veterans. They really saw Union veterans as their lifeblood in elections. The Democrats are the party of personal liberty. They championed the idea that government should be smaller and turn more control over the states, less federal government. They supported the idea of the national government printing more money, putting more currency into circulation. During the Gilded Age, the two parties stake out the different sections of the country and where they're going to hold political power. The Democrats, of course, after Reconstruction ended, they're going to hold on to the South for the next 100 years. The Republicans are going to find their support up in the North. Okay? These little green states are ones that flip. They switched. They were what we call swing states, and the little letter inside them tells you, okay, which party did they vote with a majority of the time. Okay? Now, even though these are the differences between the parties, both of them tended to back business interests. Democrats occasionally would take the interests of workers and unions, but for the most part, the government takes that laissez-faire approach in support of business. As this political cartoon shows, Lady Liberty being threatened by the monopolies. And this fellow over here asking Uncle Sam, so what are you going to do about that? Man, Uncle Sam basically saying, it's none of my business. There are a couple of third parties in the Gilded Age. They never take over the presidency, obviously. They had slight impact on Congress and maybe party platforms. One of those parties is called the Greenback Party. The Greenback Party wanted the government to print more paper money. So where we saw the Democrats having kind of that liberal, let's print more money philosophy, they're influenced by the Greenback Party. The reason they wanted the government to print more paper money was when there is more money in circulation, that makes the currency, the paper, worth less. That's two words, worth less. Meaning your paper money cannot buy as much as it used to. You need more of the paper money to buy the same thing you just bought, say, last week, last month, whatever. This is called inflation, when prices go up. The Greenback Party wanted there to be inflation because they felt this would make it easier for people who were in debt, especially farmers, to be able to pay those debts off. Okay? If the bank loans you $1,000 today, and then inflation happens and prices go up, as a farmer, you're able to get more money, more currency now for your product, but the $1,000 loan stayed the same. They don't take into account inflation, how much do you owe the bank? And so it would be easier for farmers to pay those off. There's another party out there called the Prohibition Party. They wanted to ban alcohol. They saw alcohol as kind of being the root cause of evil. We've heard about that maybe with the temperance movement in the mid-1800s. They're not successful in the Gilded Age, but they are gradually getting more and more people to join their cause. All right, so some of the presidents in the Gilded Age. We'll start with the early ones. Let's not forget that the Gilded Age begins at the end of the Civil War, roughly 1865. So we could include Andrew Johnson in this. I didn't. I started with Ulysses S. Grant. He's president from 1869 to 1877. He gets reelected in there. Unfortunately for Ulysses S. Grant, he is not a political leader. He is not a good manager of people. Some people give him credit for being a good general, but he's definitely not a discerning president. He appoints a lot of corrupt individuals to different offices, not only his cabinet, but other federal jobs. He himself was not corrupt. There's no evidence that Ulysses S. Grant participated in his corruption. He just didn't see what these people were doing, which makes him more inept than anything. Some of the major events while he's president, there are scandals. The Credit Mobiler scandal, which we've talked about, which involved big business and Congress. Also something called the Whiskey Ring, where the people who licensed liquor distilleries paid bribes and took bribes and kickbacks. It involved his personal secretary, the guy who sat outside the Oval Office. Now, after Ulysses S. Grant came Rutherford B. Hayes. We talked a lot with him in Reconstruction. He's president from 1877 to 1881. We talked about him earlier because he was elected due to the Compromise of 1877, if you go back to those Reconstruction notes. So he is president. He too, he was a more able leader and administrator than Grant, but he too, like a lot of these guys, are going to kind of defer to Congress. What is Congress doing? What does Congress want? Kind of a go along to get along. The big important thing that happens while he's president is, of course, he ends Reconstruction. Now, after Grant and Hayes, we have a group that we call the Forgettable presidents. Because there have been 45 presidents in our nation's history, and if you were to sit down and make a list, you could do it 1 through 45, or just, okay, give me the 45. I don't know how you would do, but these next group of presidents are going to be the ones you're going to miss because they didn't do much. Okay? James Garfield, start off the list. He's elected president in 1880, and he serves as president in 1881. He has the second shortest presidency in U.S. history. When he runs for president, he actually ran on a platform of civil service reform. Because of the corruption in those federal jobs, he and others believed there should be some kind of qualification to make sure that whoever applied for a job was qualified for it. Unfortunately for him, as president, all these people that, I worked for you, therefore I deserve a job, right, show up, and he denies several of them jobs. One of them gets angry. And one day while Garfield is traveling, his itinerary was published in the paper, and this guy is going to catch him at the train station and assassinate him. That leaves Garfield's vice president, Chester A. Arthur, to take over. Chester A. Arthur was a product of the political machines. But he's going to take over from the reform-minded Garfield from 1881 to 1885. Even though he was a product of the political machines, he uses the death of Garfield, and there's enough sympathy for Garfield's death to get Congress to pass this thing called the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act is what created the civil service system. Now, what the civil service system does, if you want a job with the federal government, you have to take the civil service exam. And depending on what kind of job you want, they're kind of job specific. But whatever, these potential federal employees have to take this exam, and whoever scores highest is who we offer the job to first. Arthur is also president when Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. After Arthur came Grover Cleveland. He will be the one Democrat on this list. Everyone else is Republicans. Grover Cleveland is president from 1885 to 1889. While he's president, Congress will pass the Dawes Severalty Act and the Interstate Commerce Act. Cleveland runs for re-election in 1888, but he's defeated by Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison will serve as president from 1889 to 1893. While he is president, Congress will pass the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. Congress will also be referred to as the $billion Congress. For the first time in U.S. history, the Congress passed an annual budget of $1 billion. Now, this was a shocking thing, and a lot of that number was wrapped up in pensions to those former Union veterans. In 1892, Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland run against each other again. And in 1892, Grover Cleveland is going to win. He's going to win the presidency back. He is the only president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. In this second term of his, we'll have something called Coxeys Army. Jacob Coxey was a man who he rallied a bunch of unemployed workers from the Midwest around him. This is a picture of Coxey's Army down here in the bottom left. They're not marching with guns. They're not marching with any ill intent. But what they did is they marched from the Midwest, and they walked through towns. They walk all the way from the Midwest all the way to Washington, D.C. The reason they're going to Washington, D.C. is they want the government to print more money. They wanted the government to print what they called legal tender. Legal tender is paper money that is not backed by anything. In other words, you can't take it to the bank and trade it in for something tangible like gold. It is just worth what the paper is worth. They wanted that because they wanted to cause inflation, because inflation would help people pay off their debts. They also wanted Congress to create some kind of job program which would allow these unemployed guys to find work, and they said, look, this would be a great thing. We'll build public works. And that will help out unemployment. That'll help these guys get a job, and it'll provide necessary buildings and roads and whatever else for the country. During his second term, there's also something called the Pullman Strike, which we've been over. Cleveland uses federal troops to end the Pullman Strike. This is also when the Plessy versus Ferguson decision came down. All right, that is it for politics in the Gilded Age. I hope you enjoyed that overview and that gave you the information you'll need.